last week, I made a video showing you my Aglaonema rotundum, and some of you were really excited to see it. And some of you messaged me on Instagram and were less impressed. Perhaps I slighted the Calathea Ornata in my video last week by saying that the Aglaonema rotundum was as pretty as an Ornata, but easier to take care of. And maybe some of you thought I was going to be leaving Calatheas behind. That's not the case. Today, let me make up for my slight against the Calathea Ornata. I'm going to be talking about the Calathea Ornata, specifically an article that was written about it in the mid-90s. It's an article that was written by botanist and researcher Helen Kennedy. She is really a giant in the Calathea taxonomy world, and I'm really eager to talk about her work with you. I do follow her work, including some of her work that dates back a little ways into the mid-1990s, but also her more recent work. So if that interests you and you want to geek out on Calatheas with me today, please stick around. And if that doesn't sound interesting to you, that's okay too. I am going to be getting two Calatheas that for me are hard to get and rather rare, and I'll be sharing those with you probably next week. So maybe check back then for content that is more up your alley. But for those of you who are interested, hang out and let's get started. So as I mentioned, Helen Kennedy is a botanist and a researcher, and she's done a lot of amazing taxonomy work centered on the Calathea. In the mid-1990s, she gave a presentation at a symposium that was titled The Calathea Ornata and Relatives, an Ornate Confusion, and an article with the same title was published the following year in a horticulture journal. And I found this article about 2 years ago now, after I received a series of really interesting comments here on YouTube from someone about the naming conventions around the Calathea Ornata and why we often incorrectly identify plants as ornatas when they're not. And Kennedy's article really goes over both the history and the confusion around the naming conventions. Now, last week, as I said earlier, I showed off my Aglaonema rotundum, and I talked about how its pinstripe style foliage reminded me of an ornata. And I think for a lot of us, why we're attracted to Calatheas is that they have just amazing foliage, and it seems like everybody has a favorite. And I know that I have two favorites, and the first would be the Calathea rosy, and the second would be the Calathea dotty. And if you follow my channel, you know that I really wanted these plants and that I passed up the chance to get them initially, and then I couldn't find any on the market for 2 years. And then pretty quickly, within 6 months, I got both a dotty and I ended up buying two rosies. I guess I bought one and a backup just in case. So that foliage is what really attracts me. And the interesting thing about the foliage here is that in the dotty over its life course is going to look different, but the pattern on the foliage is going to, for the most part, remain the same, and the color will, for the most part, remain the same. However, the rosy is a different story. Often that beautiful pink that we think of with the rosy that's in the center of the leaf can fade away to like a bluish green over time as it matures. And that helps lend itself to some of the confusion around the ornata, about polymorphic plants, about using sort of phytomorphology to identify plants, and how when plants change how they look over the course of their lives, it becomes really easy to misidentify them when we're just using visible structures of the plant, such as pattern or color, to identify a species. So within my own collection, I know that I already have plants that are like this, plants that won't look the way that they do now. Now, Calatheas, like I said, there's a lot of variety in the foliage, and a lot of that is down to species, but not always. So what I didn't know and I really hadn't thought about before, that's contained in the introduction of Kennedy's paper, is that 95% of the species in the prayer plant family, so the Marantacea family, from what was known in 1995 at least, that had these pattern leaves were from tropical America, that's 95%, and that Calathea comprised 86 of the 255 patterned varieties. And if we're thinking about other groups of plants that are falling into the prayer plant family, we're thinking about Tenanthes and Stromanthes and Marantas. They're all included in this group, and the Calathea has the highest ratio of this patterned foliage. And so I don't think it's any surprise that there are so many Calathea lovers out there, because there are so many different patterns. It seems like there's one to suit everybody's taste. If you don't think you like the way one Calathea looks, I mean, you have a huge amount of options of other Calatheas to choose from. One of the things that we've talked about a lot here, and there's been a lot of discussion and information in the comments around the Calathea Ornata, is how its patterns and leaf color change over time or as it matures. And I think Jake has been the most recent person to bring this up. And what that means is that in the juvenile plant, that's the plant that most of us are familiar with. And the juvenile plant has beautiful dark green leaves and cream or pinkish pinstripe patterns on the foliage, and the underside is usually a beautiful purple. Now the thing is that over time, these plants can change, and the plant that we often refer to as the Ornata will lose its pinstriping, or it'll fade away until it's barely visible. The plant will get much taller than you might suspect. It'll lose some of that compact shape and bushiness, and even that purple underside can fade away to green. So you might not recognize this species of plant if you don't know what it looks like as a juvenile and then what it looks like as a mature plant, and maybe any of the stages between these two sort of polarized images of the plant. So back in the mid-19th century, around 1840, 1850, when the Ornata was being documented in horticulture journals across the world, a lot of what was recorded focused on juvenile plants, maybe without people realizing it. And Kennedy makes the point that a lot of confusion also came about because of this focus on juvenile plants, and how some can be what, to quote her, are polymorphic for pattern. And so that means that these plants can lose their pattern over the course of their lives. The pattern can change. And because of this fluctuation, plants that are in the same species can look different. Their patterns can look different from each other. And I find that I agree. I know that I said we've had these discussions in the comments from people who have really mature Calatheas who might be growing outdoors that have completely lost that pinstriping and that have gotten very tall and aren't the Ornata that we think of. They're not the plant that we think of when we picture that really sort of, and I think most of our minds, classic pinstriping. The thing is that once the plants that were being documented back in the mid-19th century became established inside of botanical gardens, the plants started to flower. And it was the fluorescence that started to cue people off that, oh, these are distinct species. We've lumped a lot of plants that have this pinstriping into the same species, and perhaps they're not. So a lot of confusion, according to Kennedy, is really originating from the use of juvenile plants to sort of identifying the species. And Kennedy also gives examples of how the Calathea majestica and the Calathea princeps were thought to be the same species at one time, but now the princeps is considered to be a cultivar of the majestica. So the inverse can also happen. It isn't just having a variety of different species confused as one species. Sometimes we confuse the same species or a cultivar of a species as being distinct species. And again, this does change over time as people learn more about plants. And so if you think about the morphology or the phytomorphology, that kind of study of what physical forms plants take, what their external appearance looks like, their structures, as opposed to something like the actual anatomy of plants, you can see that Calatheas look over their life course quite different. And if we think about even something like, say, the Calathea Wilson princeps, which is in a botanical garden in North Carolina, this plant starts out rather compact and bushy and looking really full, but it can grow up to 4 feet tall, and the pattern on it can change. the color can change, and it might not be recognizable to us if we only know the plant in the juvenile form. And so that's something to keep in mind, because Calatheas, as a lot of people will discuss online, can be difficult plants to maintain. And so I don't know how many of us really maybe know what a mature Calathea looks like in person, that's reached its full height and whose pattern has kind of settled into its sort of permanent look. And I see a lot of discussion about that, about, well, your whatever species or variety looks different from mine. Mine is, more compact, or mine is more bushy. And the thing is that the way that these plants really look over time changes. So in the mid-90s, when Kennedy was giving this presentation, and then later in the paper, she noted that what was then being sold as a Calathea Ornata was actually often majestica, and that what had been referred to as varieties of the Ornata were actually distinct species. And so in the end, I think I have to take a guess sometimes at the plants that I have. And I think maybe, we go back and forth on the channel. Is this a Sanderiana? Is it a Rosio leonata? What is this plant? And another example of how confusing this can be is just doing an image search for something like Calathea Sanderiana and seeing all of the different types of Calathea that pop up, and trying to understand, just based on the pattern morphology, can we actually identify the Sanderiana? And I would say there wasn't just confusion around the Ornata in the mid-90s. The confusion lives on and is very much alive in 2020. So if you have a favorite of these pinstriped Calatheas, let me know in the comments. I mean, I haven't even scratched the surface, really, of the pinstriped Calatheas that exist. I've had in the past a Vittata. I've had a variety of different pinstriped Calatheas, including what I think was a Sanderiana, majesticas, white stars. What's your favorite? What do you have? And do you feel confident that you understand its distinct species? And have any of you had any of them flower? If so, what did the flowers look like? I hope you've enjoyed this video today, and until next time, be well and take care.